So not too long ago, Adobe announced that Premiere Rush would be coming to Android. So I decided I'd go ahead and test this piece of software out. And in its current state, I believe it is only available on Samsung devices through the Samsung App Store. And the reason why they've done that is so that they can optimize the software better for just a few specific models of phones. Because of course, trying to get a piece of software like that to run smoothly on every Android device would be quite difficult. So at least for now, it's only available on Samsung phones, I believe, though that should change in the future. So if you're not familiar with the concept of Adobe Premiere Rush, essentially what it's supposed to be is a cloud-synced video editing software. So essentially what you're supposed to be able to do is maybe start a project on your phone or your computer, and theoretically it's a fully featured video editing software that you can use on a phone. Now, Adobe released the iOS version of Premiere Rush quite some time ago, and I've been patiently waiting for the Android version to be released. And it's now released, and I gotta test it out, and I gotta say, it's not that great. Now, one thing that I saw somewhere in either Samsung or Adobe's media was the ability to use that software with something called Samsung DeX. Now, if you're not familiar with Samsung DeX, essentially what it allows you to do is take an adapter to go from the USB-C port at the bottom of the phone, and you can plug in a keyboard, a mouse, and a monitor, and it allows you to have a desktop experience, hence the name DeX, with nothing but a smartphone. And it's kind of a cool concept, but it really doesn't seem like it has that many practical uses. Maybe if you just wanted to edit Excel sheets or something on your phone using a keyboard and mouse, I guess that'd be kind of nice, but it's just not a real desktop replacement for somebody like me that wants to do video editing or photo editing, stuff like that. Now, in theory, Adobe Premiere Rush would allow you to use your phone as a full-blown video editing PC, essentially. And with modern phones, these are powerful enough to edit video without much of a problem. The issue is that the software that Adobe has given you is honestly just plain terrible, at least the Android version. I haven't been able to test the iOS version. And the Windows version, which you can see behind me, isn't as bad, but it's still got some weird bugs and things in it that shouldn't be there. Now, originally I set out to try to edit a video on nothing but a smartphone. Now, I thought this would be an interesting experiment because really, if you can edit a video on a smartphone, you can pretty much produce an entire video on nothing but phone. And some people have had success doing this with other pieces of software before Adobe Premiere Rush, of course, but I thought we'd go ahead and give Premiere Rush a try because I've been kind of excited to try it out. So the first thing I did was transfer the files from my computer onto the phone. So I went ahead and set up DeX, which is pretty simple. I just use this adapter that I actually bought for my laptop. It takes USB-C input, it gives you an HDMI port, 3 USB ports, Ethernet jack, an SD card reader, and a micro SD card reader. I plugged in a monitor, I plugged in a keyboard and mouse, and I opened up Adobe Premiere Rush. And it looks something like this. And I went ahead and selected my media. As you do with Premiere Rush, you select it in the order that you want it to show up in the timeline because it kind of automatically gets thrown into the timeline. And once I selected it and let it import all those files, it showed up in the timeline, it looked fine, and I went ahead and started editing it. And the very first thing that I noticed when I started trying to edit this was that pressing the space bar on my keyboard did absolutely nothing. Now, if you're unfamiliar, pretty much every editing software out there uses the space bar to pause and play the video, including Adobe Premiere Rush on Windows. I have no idea why on earth the space bar was not set up to be used as the play pause key. In fact, there is no keyboard shortcut for the play pause button. You have to manually move your mouse over to the play pause button and click on it every time you want to do that. If you've ever edited a video before, at least if you edit like I do, you use that spacebar shortcut quite a bit. Now, there were other keyboard shortcuts implemented that weren't the play pause thing. For example, pressing the S key on the keyboard would allow you to split the video clip wherever you are currently at in the clip. So right along that current time indicator, as it would be called in Adobe Premiere Pro. So that was my first issue, and at this point I'm thinking, well, that's not really that big of a deal. It's just gonna make it more annoying. I'm gonna have to click on the button with the mouse every time. That shouldn't be too bad, right? So when I'm editing videos, I think the most useful thing that I'm doing for the kind of content that I create, which would be quite similar to this, usually just me talking. But what's useful to me is having a large audio waveform displayed so I can see where exactly I start and stop talking, and I can cut out parts that I don't want. things like that. So there is a way to expand the audio tracks in Adobe Premiere Rush, and that simple, works fairly well. Another big complaint that I have about this app is zooming in and out of the timeline. So normally with Premiere Pro, you use the plus and minus keys on the keyboard and it zooms in and out of the timeline. Adobe Premiere Rush does the exact same thing, except for it goes from relatively zoomed out to way zoomed in just one button press. And it's quite annoying because you're either zoomed out too far to really precisely edit the video, or you're zoomed in way too far in order to be able to move the clip around and do useful things with it. So my next complaint has to do with audio again. When you're zoomed in this far, you get a pretty nice detailed audio waveform, at least for a little while. If you start playing the video, eventually the audio waveform just kind of disappeared, and eventually the audio itself would just completely disappear. And I did kind of think for a minute that maybe I'm just overloading my phone, so I went ahead and shut off the screen recording software, and that didn't change it at all. So I'm kind of assuming that that's just the app at this point. So not being able to see the audio waveform for one thing is a pain, and then not being able to hear it basically makes editing completely impossible. Alright, so after messing with Adobe Premiere Rush on DeX for a little while, I got frustrated with it, and I went ahead and unplugged my little adapter and just went to the straight Android app directly on the phone. Now this solves some of my complaints. First off, there was no longer a space bar to press to play and pause, so that fixed that, I guess. And with the timeline, you could just pinch to zoom the timeline, and you could zoom in or out to exactly what you want. You weren't stuck relying on those sort of notches that the Samsung DeX version of the app had. One thing that I will say is that going from DeX into the normal mobile version transitioned smoothly, and it picked up right where I left off, so that worked fairly well. Until I started to edit again, and I noticed another major problem having to do with audio. So this time is a bit of a different issue. The audio and the video were just horribly out of sync. So the audio and the video sync would be out by several seconds, and places where there would be a gap where it looked like I shouldn't be talking, you would hear me talking, and where there was very clearly an audio waveform where I was talking, there would be silence. That's how far off it was. It's pretty bad. You'll see that in the clips.
We've had quite a bit of rain recently.
And of course, when you're trying to cut out minor details in the video because of mistakes in words that were said, this audio-video sync being out makes it pretty much a useless editing app. So after having all of these issues with the Android version of Premiere Rush, I went ahead and thought, well, let's try to finish this out on the Windows version. Now, once I figured out how to sync a project, I believe you have to manually enable sync for every project, but as soon as I did that, within a couple of seconds, the project showed up on the Windows version of Adobe Premiere Rush, and it looks something like the screen that you see behind me. Now, of course, this is kind of expected because I had about 11 or 12 gigs worth of video files that needed to be uploaded to the cloud and then re-downloaded by this computer. So that wasn't going to show up instantly, but what did show up instantly was all of the cuts and things that I'd already made in the video. So the timeline was already set up. I just needed to get the video files into the computer. Now I have a horrendously slow internet connection. So what I figured I could do was go ahead and just manually select the files since they're already on this computer, which would be similar to what you would do if you've ever tried to move an Adobe Premiere Pro project from one computer to another. Usually what you end up with is sort of a red error screen like that that says media offline on it. And you would go in and basically with Adobe Premiere Pro, it's kind of nice because you can just select one file, and it usually does a pretty good job of figuring out where the rest of the files are, assuming that you organize them somewhat decently when you set up your project. And as it turns out, you can manually select files in Adobe Premiere Rush as well. The problem is it's completely broken. So I went in, so you click on the little menu and it says manually link or something along those lines. And you go find the file, you click on it, you select the file, and sure enough, it selects that file and it links it automatically. But it only does one file at a time. It doesn't automatically find all of them like it would with Adobe Premiere Pro. But I kind of figured that was okay, and I went ahead and continued to select each file individually. There wasn't really that many of them. The problem is it started doing some really weird stuff. So I would try to link one file, and it would end up linking it to a different file. And then some files I just couldn't get to link to anything, and it would just continue to link to the wrong files. You'll notice as I try to select one video file, the thumbnail for a different video continues to change. And this is the software for some reason linking the wrong video files compared to what I'm telling it to. And I'm not entirely sure what was going on with this, but it was really annoying, and it did not work out because it did indeed link the wrong files. So it pretty much destroyed any chance that I had of editing that video on the Windows version of the software. Now, in conclusion of all these issues, basically what it feels like is a piece of beta software that you have to pay for. It feels very much like a public beta, and it feels like something that shouldn't even be released to the public. The Android app in particular feels like it's something that shouldn't be even in public hands yet. The Windows version isn't as bad. I do believe I tried to edit one video on it before, and I was able to complete it. It's a pretty basic editing software, but it's good enough for what I need it to do. And I figured that the Android version would be very similar, but after messing with both of these pieces of software, they really do feel like they're beta or maybe even alpha releases. They do not feel like something that should be in the public at all, let alone something that they should be able to charge you money for. From what I've seen, the Windows version of the software has some small issues that are probably considered to be edge cases, like me trying to manually link media. It's something that if the option is there, it should probably work correctly, but unfortunately it doesn't seem to. And really, the entire app on Android seems pretty awful. Now, I will give the Android app some credit, mostly in the fact that it actually does run really well. I was kind of surprised. I was editing 4K 30 FPS video off of my Panasonic G7 that I'm filming with now, and it really didn't stutter either on Samsung DeX or on the phone itself. Now, editing that same footage on the Windows software, it did stutter a little bit. It wasn't unusable. I'm running this software on a kind of old but still pretty powerful PC, and it's more than powerful enough to edit 4K 30 FPS video in Adobe Premiere Pro. So anyway, if you were thinking about purchasing Adobe Premiere Rush to edit videos on, I would probably recommend not doing so, especially if you're going to be trying to use Android. I cannot speak for the iOS app, of course. There's probably other videos that show how well the iOS app works, but honestly, there's probably better alternatives out there to Adobe Premiere Rush. One of the sort of unfortunate things about Android is that there really isn't that much for video editing software, and at least not that I'm aware of. And Adobe Premiere Rush is probably one of the few ones that is kind of fully featured. But at this time, it seems pretty bad. They are updating it. I actually just got an update for it last night, and I did retest all of these same experiments, and it didn't change anything. So I'm not entirely sure what that update did, but it didn't seem to make any difference for what I was trying to do. To be honest with you, I'm not really even sure how Adobe charges money for this software. I believe that Adobe Premiere Rush actually does have some sort of free trial period. I'm not sure. I was using this under my Creative Cloud subscription just to test it out and see if it was any good, and in my opinion and in my testing from what I've seen, it's really not. At least not the Android version. The Windows version doesn't seem as bad, but it's still got some weird bugs and things. And really, the entire thing just feels like it should be in beta testing. It really shouldn't be something that should be sold to the public at this point. I do think it has some serious potential, but it also needs some serious updates before it can reach that potential. So anyway, those are my thoughts on the Android and Windows versions of Adobe Premiere Rush. Hopefully you guys found that useful. If you were thinking about buying the software, consider clicking that like button and sharing this video on whatever social media platforms you want to. If this video gets big enough, maybe Adobe will even consider actually fixing their software. That's kind of doubtful, but it's worth a shot. Anyway, that's about it for now, guys. Bye.